Okay, so thank you first for the invitation. Glad to be here. I am not an economist. I am a journalist. I covered political economy for like around 10 years. So I covered stock markets, the healthcare system, the pension system, anything that has related basically with the economy. And I'm also a historian by training. So I did, many different things at the beginning. And now I have ended this kind of journey of knowledge, if you will, studying constitutional law. So I did political theory in between. I did a little bit of sociology, media studies, tried to kind of know the world as many forms and from many positions as possible. Okay. We met in a conference on the energy commons and law. So how can we create energy communities at the local level in a way to build alternatives? And this is where we met. And basically, he convinced me to read Kelso's work and engage with it. So this is kind of my result a little bit. I don't want to be, too boring. But the idea was to basically take Kelso's ideas from the 50s. And we saw, this clip also again by Baldwin, in which there are different things that were happening in the world, but not much has changed. It has changed for the worse in a way. We have more problems now than even before. So how can we engage productively with someone that lived in the 50s and thought that basically the welfare state was working fine and we can actually do this in a way and be all owners from now that is even worse than when he was writing, right? Or even right after. So this presentation is a thought experiment. It's like, how can we think about what he would think, what he would say, and what alternative he would put us in front of us. But first, I want to engage with a specific essay that I read very deeply. And the title is a play on this essay that is basically talking about Karl Marx and how, for him, Karl Marx was wrong in 3 counts. I'm going to talk about the specificities, but basically he said that if Marx, would have become, and understood capitalism better, he would have become a capitalist in a way, and he was almost a capitalist. So I want to engage with that and kind of turn it around and say, if Kelso would have lived today and would have been confronted with the things that we have today, he would be an almost socialist. So kind of put it like that. So first, I have 3 quotes from this essay. So it's in 1957. It's a law journal. And first, he talks about the Industrial Revolution and how Marx was very accurate in the sense of the problem of social justice that capitalism poses. And he was on board with it, basically, that he says at the beginning, so not in his time, but at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, everything was crooked in a way. There was, he says, irresponsible banking, inadequate knowledge, rampant exploitation of fraud, right? We have all kinds of things that do not work in the system because basically that was at the beginning. But when he was writing, everything kind of felt more in place in a way and felt a little bit more productive. However, he thought that Marx, and basically the whole essay is about him being wrong, how Marx basically was a disappointment in the sense that if he would have become a capitalist in his mind, he could have basically influenced Russia and other, communist countries to become capitalists. And therefore, we would live in a very different world today. Of course, this is not the case. If we think about, the Soviet Union being just another capitalist system, or at least in this transition, we will be basically in the same place, not really in a different one, right? And then the other thing that is important, and of course he says that basically it is capitalism what brings hope, that basically the working classes can become richer through capitalism. And there's a hope for economic well-being and all these things that were the promise of capitalism. So how do we think about it today? Today, it is almost the opposite. We think about capitalism as kind of preventing many people to get ahead in a way because of the rules of the game. And we can talk about this at length after. And finally, the other quote that I bring is that what he engages with nature. So Kelso had nothing to say about, the environment and nature. And in that moment, it felt that basically nature was just one more resource and there was no problematizing with nature. And he talks about humans being masters of the earth, right? And this idea that we kind of control and we are owners and we colonize and we conquer and then we use for ourselves in a way. And this is kind of normal talk. Today, it feels completely off base in a way to even think about nature in this matter if we are a little bit progressive, right? And for him, he says the worker is not really the master of the earth. Marx is wrong. The worker has no real power. And then we agree. We have very, very little power when we are in the worker's position. For him, it is the intelligent plan that is foreseeing where the company is going. So for the managerial class or the managers, the CEOs, the people planning, and the consumers. Those are the two basically poles of power in the system. And therefore, we need to think about those as citizens and in those roles in order to get that power in a way and democratize wealth. So here I want to kind of bring a little parallel, and in the middle there's a little of an olive branch between these two thinkers. And basically Kelso argued, as James was saying before, that he thought about a society of owners. And this is a very kind of course, this is a liberal tradition that goes back to one of them is John Locke, right? One of the fathers of liberalism. And the idea that we need to have a society and a democracy of property owners. We all need to be property owners. Of course, when John Locke was writing in the 17th century, property owners were around 10% of the population or 20% of the population. So when he's saying, well, only property owners can be citizens or be active citizens, then he's not saying that everybody should have property. It's that only the people with property should be making the decisions, right? In a way. Kelso was saying the other way around. Like, in a way, we need to expand this, right? We need to make everybody property owners and therefore be more autonomous. And for him, the most important thing that Marx was wrong about is that capital creates wealth. It's not only the worker that creates wealth with the work, but it's also capital, the machines, everything that is it is involved in the production that is owned by someone that has invested in it, right? So this creates capital. It's not just dead, labor, as the Marxists would say. It is actually productive of wealth. So therefore, in order to be productive, we need to expand it. So his idea was to democratize the ownership of the means of production, right? Everybody needs to be kind of a producer / owner / manager in a way in his ideal, right? And on the other hand, we have Marx, and of course, we can go into it, but this is Kelso looking at Marx, not Marx himself. And it's a caricature of Marx, of course, because for Kelso, Marx proposed a society of workers in which everybody should be a worker, right? And workers have the power. And therefore, in order to make labor the only creator of wealth, in a way, we need to really be everybody work and abolish the private means of production, the private ownership of the means of production. Everybody should be the owner, and because we cannot do that in a way, the state needs to take over, and this kind of like is the middle road that. There's dispute about what really were Marx's ideas at the moment. I would say very briefly that the aim of Marx was not to create everybody who should be a worker. Everybody should work a little bit, of course, but his ideal is that in the morning we do some work, then in the afternoon, in the middle of the day we go fishing, and then in the afternoon we read some poetry, and then we go dancing. This is the idea of the ideal, right? We need to work a little bit. So therefore, we need to distribute labor also fairly, right? Because there's tasks that nobody wants to do. There's, everybody needs to pitch in. Some people cannot work, right? So therefore, we need to make a system in which everybody pitches in with what they can, right? So the idea that everybody should include basically their resource depending on what they need and what they have as a human being, right? And for him, there's no other way to do this but abolish the private property. So on one hand, we have the kind of democratizing of ownership, everybody's owner, and the other, there's no ownership whatsoever in a way. There's only private ownership of your things, but not of the means of production. However, they're both talking about the socialization of capital. And today, in a moment in which machines actually do much of the work, right? In the sense that, they produce much of the wealth, and the machines are owned by less than 1% of the population today, it is really easy in a way to socialize the machines, right? In a way, if it's, capital is more dispersed, it's really difficult to get a hold of it. But now capital is so concentrated that we really can socialize it in a different manner. Maybe not in the violent way of taking over as a dictatorship of the proletariat, but in a way of a kind of thinking about alternatives of how to really kind of socialize this means. And therefore, Kelso's ideas are very interesting. And I think it is kind of an olive branch for today. So what are the problems today? Today, we live in an oligarchic world. This is in the world, the richest 10% own 77% of the global wealth. And of course, the richest 10% tend to be in the global north. And I am no James Baldwin, but I am from the global south. So I can tell you that really we share a kind of a subordinate position in the world, and our resources are being extracted for the benefit of, the richest countries, which take to be in the global north, except for Australia and New Zealand. And the problem, and in addition with, this wealth being concentrated, is that, the bottom 50% almost doesn't own anything. So basically it's around 1%, but it depends, because in many places, either is even negative because they owe things. It's not like they're in debt about consumer debt, not even mortgages, but actual debt of being alive in a way to just pay for your things. So 50%, half of the population has nothing. And the middle class is shrinking. And this is the reality that we face today. And if we think about, the world being today, when Kelso was writing, democracy was not the only game in town. There were many different hybrids. There were alternative things of regimes. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, democracy really became the only game in town. So it was the democracies increased threefold. So immediately, this kind of regime in which elections, and you have a parliament, and you have the president, separation of powers, this regime that we call democracy, and in my work, I cannot call it democracy because the demos, the people, is nowhere to be found. We just elect others to rule us. So this is not really democracy in the historical understanding. It's more an electoral government. In a way, this is how we need to think about it. We don't really govern. It's spread out, basically. All of the countries in the world, the majority, 168, are democracies today, more or less, right? So it's not about, in a way, sharing political power and thinking that we can change the world by electing people that will actually create rules in order to democratize the means of production. It's happened the other way around. The electoral system, which historically was a means of allocating power that was related to aristocracy, not to democracy, because election it makes you distinguish, makes you vote for someone that is better than you, more special than you, that has more power, more knowledge, more rhetoric than you. So therefore, it is better than us, and it's a way of distinguishing others. So we select our elite by election, right? And this is what, elections are. So we moderns have paired this electoral system, which was used in the antiquity for oligarchic or aristocratic systems, we have made it the center of our democratic systems. And this is something that we really need to think about when we think about democratizing, what that means, right? So the problem here is not only that we have oligarchic democracies that are governed really by the 1% or the 10%, and the legislation and the regulation that they do enable that class to enrich themselves further and further and further without any limit. And this happens everywhere and at different degrees, but everywhere. Even in most of the Nordic countries, in Sweden, this is actually happening everywhere. The inequality is growing. And the problem with the global south and the global north is that whatever prosperity and whatever energy transition we have in the global north is always at the expense, as Baldwin say, at the expense of the global south. Because all of the raw materials and the cheap labor that is needed to keep things, affordable are coming from poor countries that are former colonies and basically are kind of fair game for extraction. And the problem is, and I do not agree with what the lithium, the kind of owning lithium, and then we can talk about, the relation to property, is that if we keep the mentality that we are not part of nature, that we are separated from it, and we're going to extract from it, we only think about extractivist ways of transitioning. Lithium is a non-renewable resource. And we are basing our transition and our energy future on something that is going to be extinct. And in addition, you cannot mine a salt flat responsibly or sustainably. You're going to kill it. There's no other way around it. All the microorganisms, everything that, and in every kind of thing that we extract from nature, we're doing the same thing. We are wrecking, as you said before, we're wrecking part of the nature in order to extract this and make the energy transition possible for the global north, because it's not staying. We can get money from it. We can commodify the lithium and be better off and be a little bit richer. But this doesn't change the logic of extraction that we enact when we do this. So what has the private energy regime that basically is the result of the capitalist system until now is the destruction of nature. We have kind of created and have this mentality that renewable energy has to be large scale, making big profits. And what we have done basically is a centralized system in which there's massive infrastructure that nobody wants to have in their backyard. And there is big companies that are too big to fail. And they have too much power in the regulatory, lobbyist system, right? And all the negative externalities are never internalized. They're always, outside. The pollution happens elsewhere. And even, for example, Norway was one of the greenest countries in the world. They go and pollute, in Chile and in other places, but inside they're very green. The problem is that the planet we share, and even if you have like a green pasture and you're small, it's all going to get contaminated at the end. So we cannot think this way. We cannot think about having massive infrastructure for renewables. I think we need to think smaller and think about relating to a technology in a different manner, a technology that we want to have in our backyard and not one that we don't have, and is something that is in the rural areas and we benefit in the urban settings, right? We need to think about differently in this manner, a more integrated a form of related to technology. And we go to environmental law because, Kelso had a lot of respect and hope on the power of regulation, because in the 50s, actually regulation did work. They were pretty stringent. People were paying 70, 80% taxes of the rich, all the services that were provided. There was a lot of, laws that were followed. Today, the environmental protection agencies are being dismantled, in this trend of deregulation that allows for more pollution or for lack of enforcement, because not only about not having law, but not enforcing it, or that contracts come first rather than the health of people, for example. There are all kinds of imbalances in the system. So what happens when you regulate, and this is something that comes from Lenin and Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg, who is one I admire very much. Basically, they talk about law being the regulation of exploitation. Basically, law is not even labor law that is supposed to be the workers' law. It's not there to protect the workers. It's there to regulate the kind of labor exploitation that they're under. 10 hours, 8 hours, 7 hours, more working schedules, overtime. This is the regulation of an exploitative relation. This is the same with nature. When we regulate the extraction and the processing of different materials, we're regulating the exploitation. We're not prohibiting the exploitation. We're not saying stop to the exploitation. We're making it a little bit more manageable. And what happens is that companies are so rich that they always prefer to pay the fine than to, not pollute. And the problem with nature is that there's no way back. When the ecosystem is wrecked, there's no way back. There's no much money, no amount of money will make it up, right? So, and the state is unable to put a stop to the extraction because the extraction brings money, and it's a problem that that is related to the desires of all people, right? And we know that around 80% of the population are kind of precarious, not here maybe, but in the global south for sure, right? So those people want social rights, they want things. However, we cannot have those things at the expense of nature. We would need 6 planets for all the people in the world to have the living conditions of the global north. So we cannot have it. So we cannot just, push for having all these kinds of rights and everything or this comfort in a way for everyone. We need to think about comfort and our relation with the planet in a different manner. Okay, and what happens is that the law allows for this right to exploitation and pollution for a fee, basically. It's like you put limits as a law. You cannot contaminate because it's against the welfare of the people. You cannot extract from nature because you're going to wreck the nature. So therefore, you need to have a stop. And if you do, you need to pay a fine. And therefore, what is happening is that they just pay for exploiting the earth and polluting. And this is what's happening all over the world. And the state is unable to control it. So this is, and with this, I finish. With this kind of scenario in which the state is unable to really protect nature and is unable to produce an alternative that is suitable for living in this planet and not wrecking this planet, I would say Kelso today would really be disappointed with the idea of green capitalism, right? This idea that we are going to subsidize this transition and then these energy companies or other companies will come and make a profit out of this transition. And we have seen that with the green capitalism, nothing has been done. We go every year and nothing is done. So of course that doesn't work. So I think Kelso would have seen this and he said, okay, now it's time for me to do other things, to get deeper into the last innovations, basically on allowing for ownership and but having a different relation with property or to conceive property differently. So the liberal tradition has based liberty and the autonomy on the individual on property. For Locke, if you don't have property, you die basically, because the only way to feed yourself and nourish yourself and be alive is to mix your labor with nature. This is what property is the result of this kind of metabolic relation with nature. So that is called property. And in the idea of the liberal tradition, whenever you mix your labor with nature, you have property. However, we have a detachment of that when you have the capitalists making investments and the workers just working and being paid for their work because they're mixing their labor and they're not property owners, right? The problem is that property is understood as a privilege of the few in a way and as a way of excluding the majority of people from the benefits of something that is not even theirs. Nature is not of anyone. We don't possess nature. We're not owners of nature. Property is a contract among people, right? So there's no, even if the liberal says it's a natural right to property, this is something that is invented. Indigenous peoples in the global south do not understand the idea of property. For them, it's preposterous for them to think about themselves being owners and being able to use, abuse, and destroy the land, for example. They are stewards, they're guardians of the land, for example, or of any nature, and they are part of the ecosystem. And therefore, even if they have, strifes with other tribes about territory, this doesn't mean that they are the owners of that territory, okay? So I think, and that's kind of the indigenous way of understanding the relation with nature. There's another Western way of understanding nature that comes from the commons, from the common people, the plebeians, the people, the vulgar in a way, the people that do not have titles or wealth. And I've been studying the commons in England. So in the feudal times, of course, everything was divided among the feudal lords, right? And they had a claim to a certain territory. And in the territory, they have forests, they have lakes, they have rivers, they have shores, right? They have all kinds of land that is not considered property, is not understood as a resource for exploiting, but it was part of the realm, right? And the commons had access to that realm, and they have the right to go and pick up wood, to fish, to hunt, to roam, to even, spend the night if they need to in the forest. And this was part of the rights of the common people. However, when the transition from feudalism to capitalism happened, there was a movement for enclosures. So these common lands that were open for everybody to access, immediately they started putting fences around it. And the feudal lords who became capitalists, they said, well, now this is not the realm because, we're changing. This is now mine and I can exploit. So before, the common people had the right to pick up wood from the forest for their own, use. Then it became theft. It was criminalized. So how a right that was a common right, not to property, but to use and management and to kind of benefit from, became a crime. So I think we need to go back to the idea of having access to something that is common, that we don't own, but we need to take care of it. Because, the commons is the idea that if we overexploit the forest, we're not going to be able to benefit from the forest after. So there is an equilibrium that only the local communities are able to make. The second point that I want to make in terms of the kind of how Kelso would relate to this new scenario is that because he thought that the consumer and the manager were really the people that had the power in this moment, and basically adding Marx as the kind of the producers or the laborers, we can think about this consumer manager producer ownership. We can all be owners, but in an ownership that is limited by the collectivity. We're not just, stock owners in a way. We are also connected really at a community level. Because someone said that there's it's very difficult to have responsibility when you own something very far away. You actually need to be there. So employees will, own their own company. So they're working in it. So they have a stake in it. So we cannot really abstract and say, okay, let's all be owners in a way through the stock options, because there's no attachment. There needs to be an attachment to as a guardian in a way of what we have. And of course, we're not only talking about nature. We're also talking about the infrastructure that is necessary to harness nature. Because wind and sunlight and water does not, does not give us energy or anything by itself. We need infrastructure to actually access it. So we need to think about the infrastructure not as capital in a sense that it is foreign, but something that we own together in a way. And it is not something that we can sell because it's something for the future generations. And therefore we need to think about technology and the technology that we are going to invent and invest in a different manner, because it's not something that is going to last 10 years and going to give us some profit. It's something that really needs to be more holistic and kind of connected to nature, and that we can live with this technology, and the technology can be for the future generations. We're building for our children in a way, and not just having a quick buck in a way, as the capitalists will have it. And then this is to really end, is that the only way that you can do this is through cooperatives. The understanding that we have a responsibility to the collective. We owe something, either time, money, or labor, our, intelligence, whatever we can pitch in, right? And we're also owners, but not owners that can just sell. We're not really, it's not the same relation to ownership. It's really tight. So we can think about innovation beyond the state and having test cases, having small places where you can plant a seed in a fertile ground and have cooperatives of the community that could build alternative infrastructures for a kind of a good living, if you will, as following the Latin American trend of el buen vivir, of the kind of good living as a verb, as a commoning, as a verb in a way, not just something that exists, but as a way of life, right? So we can think about networks that could be global, because it's very difficult to think about change at the national level, or even the regional level, or even the city level. How can you really connect to millions of people? This is very difficult, but you can really do it in a small scale in your neighborhood. And perhaps you are a very progressive neighborhood and you can have this alternative infrastructure of energy or whatever a company that you want to have, or, for sustained life. And maybe you're surrounded by people that don't care, but you can be connected to in another country with another neighborhood that are really doing the same thing. And we can build a network globally that could grow in a way in this manner if we think about the solutions being local, and connected to the consumer, manager, producer. And of course, this needs to be always autonomous from the state. The state today, even if in the time of Marx, the state was seen as a vehicle for change, as a way of taking over and changing the world from above. That proved very wrong in a way, in the sense that there's always a vanguard. There's always the people, the ruling class. Doesn't matter if they're like socialist, communist, capitalist, they're the ruling class. They're a few, and they're making decisions for us. And we are just passive recipients. And therefore, we are less apt to take care of ourselves, and nature, right? We're just the beneficiaries of our welfare instead of creating and producing our own wealth. So the state here is not the enemy, but a force that we need to really keep far away from community enterprises, especially coming from the global south. The state has always been an oligarchic state, a state that has served the elites, and therefore give handouts to the people. And we were talking a little bit about these conditions of welfare. So, for example, housing. In Chile, there was a movement for housing from people that do not have a house, basically. The housing committees that live with relatives, right? That they're waiting for the state to give them a house. And they didn't want the welfare from the state. Why? Because their house was inadequate. Small, no light, no place for community, because when you live in a community setting, you need spaces for people to gather. You need spaces for privacy. However, when you build a kind of housing idea, the house is to be minimal, austere, because it's a handout, basically. It's not geared toward what is the best house that we can provide. No, it's like, what is the minimal condition for decent? And this is what you're going to get, right? And therefore you build a ghetto. So the problem is that you need to think about from the ground up, and what communities need is very different. So we really need to kind of go in and create solutions, I would say, from the local, and that is autonomous from the state, and it is based in this kind of community ownership. So I think Kelso's ideas in this regard are very interesting, because one of the problems of these communities is funding. Where do you get the money to build a turbine, to have your biomass generator, to, harness the river, whatever you need in a way? Where do you get the money? Nobody gets you the money because you don't have anything. And you're going to do GoFundMe and crowdsourcing. You have no money. You're crowdsourcing among the people that are very poor in a way. So it's very difficult to get the money that you need. You can get it from the state, but then the state, nothing comes for free. They have all kinds of regulation. So, with the funding. So in a way, going to the stock market and kind of using these ideas for funding projects that are kind of revolutionary and radical would be a way to create this network of cooperatives around the world. Thank you. Finish with this kind of motivational with the Kelsos, and saying basically the other thing about the quote is that they wanted banking knowledge and laws that would kind of benefit, future generations.